everybody. Raul here for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with an iconic bass player who needs no introduction, but I will anyway, Mark Egan.
Hey, Raul. How are you?
I'm so great. I'm so happy to talk to you. Before we were recording this, we'd mentioned that a few years ago we had a chance to chat at the Padula booth at Winter NAMM, and we had mentioned that we did want to have this conversation, and it's been a long time coming, but good things come to those who wait, and here we are. Really excited to get a chance to chat. This is coming especially at a time when a new album is getting ready to drop, and that is Electric Blue. We'll talk about that a little in depth, but as always, I like to go back in time. How did you get started in music and on bass?
Yes, a long time ago. My first instrument was actually guitar in the third grade.
Okay.
Then in the next year, in the fourth grade, I picked up trumpet. I was attracted to a trumpet. I was a trumpet player from the fourth grade all the way through elementary school, junior high school, playing in the high school bands and playing in R&B groups around the Boston area. When I was about 15, I was professional. My parents both played a little bit of music. My mother played piano, a little bit, and my father played trumpet, non-professionally. He played in the Navy, I don't know if the Navy band, but he played in a band in the Navy. So I was a trumpet player originally, but when I was 16, I really got interested in bass because I was listening to the radio, as everyone was around that time, and the music that was on the radio was Motown music and Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles, and I was attracted, for some reason, even though I was a trumpet player and professional as a trumpet player, I was attracted to the bass line. So I bought a bass, a Del Rey bass. And I had a Supro bass amp, which is actually a nice amp.
Yeah.
I didn't know it at the time. A fat tube amp. And I took some lessons with a guitar player named Mike Lally, who's from Brockton, Massachusetts, which is where I grew up in the Northeast, in Boston, 35 miles from Boston. And that was how I started playing bass, but simultaneously I was really a professional trumpet player, and then I went to go to the University of Miami to study music as a trumpet player, trumpet major, but I brought my bass with me, thankfully. I studied under the direction of Jerry Coker, who was the head of the jazz department at the University of Miami. And that's where I really opened up and really flourished as far as learning about all types of music, jazz and funk, and I'd already known a lot about rock, but that's where I really got in depth with playing jazz on trumpet, really. That wasn't until my second year there that I just happened to have a bass in my apartment that I had with someone, and a friend came over and asked who played bass, and my friend told me that Mark plays bass, and long story short is he asked me to play a gig on bass, and I did it, and he asked me to play steady with him. And so one thing led to another, and I became more in demand as a bass player in Miami at that time. There was a ton of work, clubs and shows, and I was playing 7 nights a week. At the same time, I was a trumpet major at the university and playing in the jazz band, playing jazz trumpet. I was playing jazz bass, So I realized that I really wanted to be a bass player, so I switched my majors in the middle of studying, which my parents had a little trouble with it first, but they were always very supportive. And I called them and I said, I'm switching my major to bass. And they said, well, you really want it? Do it. So I really wanted it. And that was how I got seriously into playing bass. And I transferred all the knowledge that I had on trumpet as far as harmony and scales and songs. And I transferred that over to bass. And so I remember learning bass, and because in my head I was already an established musician as a trumpet player, I sort of methodically went at it and looked at it, okay, what are the strings, what are the interval relationships between the strings, where's octaves, where are thirds, fourths. I knew all that in trumpet because I played the Haydn concerto for trumpet, and so not that that's everything, but and I was playing tunes and soloing, and I was very much influenced by Miles Davis and Clifford Brown and Kenny Dorham, all the great trumpet players, Freddie Hubbard. So I was applying all that music to bass. So that's sort of a little bit of my background up until I went to university, which is was a real turning point because that's where I met drummer Danny Gottlieb and Pat Metheny of the Pat Metheny group. And Pat Metheny.
Mm-hmm.
It's where I met Clifford Carter and the Dixie Dregs, Steve Morse, Rod Morgenstern. All the original Dixie Dregs were a rock ensemble at the University of Miami. So it's 1969. It was a very fertile time with what was happening in music generally, because you had, Hendrix, the whole rock scene, the Beatles were peaking at that time, if not breaking up very soon. And Miles Davis had just released Bitches Brew. Vishnu Orchestra just came out. Chick Corea, Return to Forever was coming out. And Herbie was doing his band, Herbie Hancock. Mm-hmm. So it was a great time. There was a lot going on. And I rose to that occasion. I was always very interested. I wanted to be around creative music and improvisational music. So it was a really lucky time for me to be there and to be around great teachers at the time.
And then with that, being in the right place at the right time and playing with Danny, that was the beginning of a almost, half-century relationship, musically speaking.
Yes, it'll be 50 years next year that we first met. And I remember the first day I met Danny, it was at the jazz school. He walked into this big rehearsal room, and he had a bag of cymbals with him. And I just remember seeing him, this guy with long hair. We all had long hair. I still sort of have long hair due to COVID-19. And I just remember that image of seeing him, and, he's such a nice person. Anybody who's met Danny Gottlieb, you just feel like he's your best friend, and he's a great person. So we got along very well, and we started playing together. So that was the beginning of playing time together then, which was probably 1970, I think. I think he came in 1970. I was there a year before him.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so as we fast forward to Electric Blue, it took all of this time for the two of you to sit down and do a duo album. It's got 8 tracks, kind of co-authored between the two of you, if I understand correctly?
Yes, and the duo, ever since you've ever played, a lot of times we just got together and played drums and bass, and we had a very good rapport with that, mm-hmm. Melodically, harmonically, and rhythmically. And so, even just to go back a little bit, in the Miami days, we would just get together and just practice them late at night and just play. Yeah. And we had gigs. We played on the road with George Goebel, the comedian. There were all kinds of these little gigs around Miami, and we were playing shows on Miami Beach, and whenever we had a chance, we wanted to play because we really wanted to play the creative music, sort of influenced by Miles Davis and the bands that he was playing. So it wasn't until we started playing with the Pat Metheny group that we really played really a lot together, because we were with that band. I was with that band for 4 years. Mm-hmm. And we were on the road about 300 days a year for 4 years. That's a lot of playing, and during that time we had a lot of time at sound checks to play duo and just playing together in any circumstance. It sort of forged our way as far as the sensibilities and the different experiences that we have. We gained a lot from the Pat Metheny group as playing as a duo, and then I went on to play session work in New York. Danny played with Pat for another year and a half, I think, or so, and then we decided to get together and do our group Elements. And actually, there are a couple tracks on many of the records that are duo tracks, but it's mainly with a group. We just kept that dialogue going with playing together, and Danny's he has such great facility with his hands and his legs, and just the way that he plays. He studied with Joe Morello, the great drummer who played with Dave Brubeck on that the song Take 5. Joe has that solo, Joe Morello. And Danny sort of followed in his footsteps. He was his protege. So, with Danny, I could be playing, a very straight ahead bass line, and he might double up the time or play 3/4 against something in 4/4, or a polyrhythmic thing. So he's always introducing different things, because he was influenced also by people like Jack DeJohnette, the great drummer Tony Williams, Elvin Jones. And those are all very creative drummers coming from different angles stylistically. And Danny really tried to incorporate a lot of elements from all of those. So when I play with Danny, he's a powerhouse, but he's also his sensibilities and his intuitiveness is always so musical. He never overplays, or it's not like I have to follow him. He's just a very simpatico type of player. So that lends itself for a duo situation. And I'm the same way as a player. You know, I like to be supportive, and I like to listen. You know, listening is such a huge thing. You know, and I tell, I don't teach that much, but you know, do master classes and things just about listening. And I equate listening not only in music, but when you're having a conversation like we're doing now. And you know, so many times I find myself and go to a party or a social gathering, not too much these days because of what's happening with the virus, but where people, you want to have a conversation, and I'm trying to have a conversation, but there's no give and take. There's no dialogue between the two. And it really takes listening and reacting and associating and relating. You know? So Danny has that through music. It's something that we have developed, and finally we said, let's do a duo record. So last year we went in the studio, into my studio in Connecticut, and we got together and laid down the tracks for this present record, Electric Blue. And, you know, it just flowed very easily. The way that it was produced and the way it went down is we said, okay, we want to have a good balance in this. We want to have all of the songs except for one were both written together, duo. There's one song, it's one of my songs, it's called Cabarete, which is a Latin piece, the second song on the CD or whatever. The other songs we composed together, and we thought of different grooves, different tempos, different key centers that would make it different on the record, so you have some peaks and valleys. It's always nice to listen to.
Yeah.
And then we also have, Danny and I like to do this thing we call waving, where we like to just create these soundscapes. And I experimented extensively since 1980, even really with, it was originally an MXR digital delay, and now I have Lexicon digital delays and looping boxes, but I especially like the PCM 42 delay, and I had it modified so it has 10 seconds of high, I think it's 16-bit, it's not 96, 16-bit, which is fine. So I can do 10-second loops, and I would do these sort of sustained things with volume pedals, with my double neck bass, with the 8-string bass, the other string fretted, and then we did some overdubs on some of the tracks. Those were some of the layering things that we did, as well as Danny put percussion on some of it. And on some of the songs, it's just duo, it's just drums and bass playing. There's a song called Hooky, like when you play hooky from school.
Yeah.
So it's called Hooky. We said it's just like a rocky sort of jammy thing that we put together. And then there's other songs that are more groove-based that we did. A thing called the title track, which is called Electric Blue. It's just a chord progression, and Danny gradually builds and builds and builds, and it really features Danny. So we wanted to capture our legacy as a rhythm section because we played together with so many people in so many circumstances. We played with Larry Coryell, Pat Metheny, John McLaughlin together, especially with the Gil Evans Orchestra. We used to be part of the Monday Night Orchestra. We played every night in New York at Sweet Basil, as well as toured around the world. With that band, we toured with Sting, and we recorded with Sting. We recorded Up From the Skies and Little Wing. And so through Gil Evans, I think that was the real experimental pot for us, because it was a small big band. I think it was like 3 trumpets, 2 trombones, 3 or 4 saxes, guitar, Aaron Bullock, Pete Levin, electric keyboards, and Gil Evans piano. And on any one night, it would be different people would come in, but it was a very free-flowing band and many soloists all the time. So as a rhythm section, if there's going to be 5 soloists in this, if we play a song, a Jimi Hendrix song, Up From the Skies, that Gil Evans arranged, or Little Wing, there's going to be 5 or 6 soloists, so you really have to use your imagination and keep, after one solo builds, you come down and you're starting a new solo, but maybe take it to a different tempo, flip it, do something completely different, lay out, let them play for a while, double time it. We go into 5/4. We stretched our minds as far as we could with that. band. And it was such a great learning period for me. And actually, Gil was always one of my big idols compositionally and as a leader. And of course, his work with Miles Davis, Sketches of Spain, is a classic. If anybody hasn't heard that, you should check it out. It's Miles Davis, Sketches of Spain. Miles Ahead plus 19 is another record that Gil arranged for Miles. And, you know, I'd mentioned Miles earlier, Miles Davis. And, you know, I always wanted to play with Miles, and I never got to play with him. But playing with Gil was almost even better. It was closer to the source because Gil Evans was Miles Davis's mentor, you know. So when I listen back to a lot of the out sessions from Miles Davis, it's always compilation sets of, you know, 20 CDs or whatever records. It's Miles Davis sessions unreleased. And sometimes you hear Gil in the control room, you know, like, oh, that was good. You know, Gil was always there. Gil was a major part of Miles's directions in a lot of, I mean, the players obviously were what Miles brought in and made it happen, because he always brought in players that were the greatest, best players in the world to bring in, put it together for a band that he wanted. But Gil had extra special things. So Danny and I, getting back to Danny and I, we learned so much about playing as a duo and as a rhythm section with the Gil Evans Orchestra. And it was so much fun. And there was nothing ever like it, except I realized that my training at the University of Miami with the jazz band there, under the direction of Jerry Coker, and then under the direction of Whit Seidner, who was the head of the jazz department after Jerry Coker left, that band prepared me for Gil Evans, because that band was very free. We played a lot of the music written by Ron Miller, who's an incredible composer in Miami. He was a professor of composition, jazz composition at the University of Miami. And that band was inspired by what was happening in 1969, 1970, 71, 72, by what was happening with Miles and Weather Report. So a person like Ron Miller was writing influenced by that. So we were playing that music. And in some ways, Raul, when I came to New York, I was disappointed with what I heard, because I had already played a lot of very progressive music in Miami. Free music, a lot of Latin grooves, there's Afro-Cuban music in Miami. It's heavy. The jazz scene down there with Ira Sullivan, who's an incredible multi-instrumentalist who I played with his band. I played upright bass in his band. So when I came to New York, I started going around and sitting in clubs and listening in clubs. And I wasn't blown away. And I don't mean to sound uppity or whatever, but I had already experienced some really high-level music, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
I really had to really look for it in Miami, and I found it. I started playing with people like Steve Jordan, the amazing drummer. Clifford Carter and I, and Hiram Bullock played with a singer named Phyllis Hyman, who came to New York with her, along with a great drummer, Billy Bowker. All of that led to, for me, playing with David Sanborn and the David Sanborn band before I played with Pat Metheny. So it's a whole sort of, for me, my background is sort of my high school years, then the Miami years, and then the New York years. Early New York was playing with David Sanborn and Diodato, and then the Pat Metheny years from that, like 1977. And then from then on, it was playing with many, many people on studio dates in New York up until now. Luckily, I grew up in the baby boomer, and I think you might have too. Are you a baby? Yeah. So I was exposed to everything. I remember when I was in high school, I was listening to my little radio, and I think it was WBCN in Boston. I think that's what it was. Because at that time, FM radio, it wasn't so formatted with real jazz, straight ahead jazz, or progressive rock, soul, because everything was on FM. So I would listen, and I'd be listening to Jimi Hendrix, and then the next thing would be some Miles Davis, and then I heard Alan Watts reciting some of his writings about Zen, and then I'd hear Ravi Shankar, and then Charlie Parker, you know. So things are much more eclectic, radio, and now everything is very compartmentalized and very stylistic as far as what station you listen to.
Sure. Well, back in the day, for those that weren't around, AM had a lot more static. The sound quality on FM was always better. So it was kind of the first reason to be on FM, because you always had your AM FM possibilities. And you're right, it was more broad spectrum. I think they were still trying to figure out how they wanted to set up programming, but you could hear a lot of variety in music. Geographic location has a huge influence on where you are. And again, whether it's the radio stations and what they're playing, during the time that you were in Miami, I being a boomer as well, but I was in Puerto Rico. And so I was being bombarded with a lot more of the Latin jazz scene, the whole Fania label, the stuff that was coming out of New York, whether it was, like on trombone, Willie Colon, or the heavy hitting trumpet, a lot of the Latin brass and all these things. And it was always evident, and I think this is something that I perceived as well in Electric Blue, the intricate enlacing of the drumming and bass. And a big part of what is so great about this album is the variety, because it's some people might go, oh, well, I'm going to listen to 8 tracks of these two guys noodling together. You managed to bring forth so much diversity and so much different musicality and feels and rhythms and things that were selected. I'm kind of visually thinking, okay, we're picking them out of the last 50 years from locations and experiences. So the Latin bit, when you hear stuff like that, you go, okay, there it is. I remember I had chatted with Rudy Sarzo, and he mentioned growing up in Havana and listening to people turning the cars that were parked in the street into like drums, and they'd get a rhythm going like a conga, and start, those old, I don't know, 50s Chevys and Fords had good resonance.
Yes.
and so this whole the beauty of it is that there's a definite percussive element both with bass, but the melodic bits that you bring into this as well are it's just a lovely merging and blend and quite diverse, which is I think what makes this so fascinating.
Yes, and it goes back to all the things that I was speaking about as far as the experiences of all the different places that we experience music from, listen to, and it's all in there. It's our vocabulary, to learn different words, and the more you read and the more you talk with people, it's the same as speaking. It's the same music. So, and I'm glad that you feel that way about the record, because that's what we wanted to get across. It's just the different sides of us that we can offer musically, but also we wanted to put it together in a very listenable thing. So it's not just a show off of drums and bass, but it's a musical journey. That's what we wanted to do.
Exactly. It's not an audition piece. Like, look what we can do. It's more, it's much more comprehensive than that.
Right.
There we go. Well, and I'd be remiss, I'd always have to ask, because there's a lot of different bass voices that I pick up when I'm listening to Electric Blue as well, and that always takes us to gear. How are you getting your sound?
Well, the basses that I played on that record are all Padula basses. They're my signature bass, 5-string, fretless and fretted. So that's the beginning of it. And then for strings on those basses, I used the Dario XL 170, which is a light gauge, 45, 65, 80, and 100. And I use a 128 on the B string. I like 128. I can play melodically with it, where if I go any heavier with it, it's just too thuddy. Yeah. So it has some of the, I call it buoyancy with it. And then most of that record, Electric Blue, I plugged in direct through a radial JDI direct box. I also used a mic pre, which is the Millennia TD1. And I used 2 of the Millennias because a lot of the time I play in stereo, depending on the songs. If there's any things that sound like they have chorusing or delays, which a lot of it has it on, I would go through effects, but I also had direct lines too. So I recorded 4 tracks of bass whenever I could. So I had the opportunity to mixing wise. mix things around. That's basically it. For effects, I mentioned earlier the Lexicon PCM42s. I also use a TC Electronics chorus, their old black box, the old TC box. They made some, I don't know if they make them anymore. They have something else now, but I like that original one.
Mm-hmm.
I like that a lot. But mostly my sound, I used to be very much into chorusing. And then lately, in the last 5 or 6 years, I got more into just the direct sound of the bass, of the fretless and the fretted. And if I use effects, I will use some delays, and then I'll put reverb on the delays. And so for the chorus, for the delay, I use the Lexicon. And for the reverb, I use also a Lexicon 200, which is a 3-space rack space. It's a physical unit.
Yeah.
That I have a few of those because I endorsed Lexicon. And Danny and I each had one, so I had 2 of them, so we used them. I had them wired into my studio. So that's the sound of the bass. That was basically how I went in with it. And gear-wise, I use Mark bass amps. I like their 12-inch cabinets. So I usually use 2 stacked cabinets. And the Mark bass, the Mark III, it's a tube front end.
Okay.
I think it's 800 watts. So. In addition, another instrument that I mentioned, that I didn't mention, is the Marlowe bass, is a new bass for me.
Mm-hmm.
I play in conjunction with my Padula basses. I'm playing the Marlowe Photon Deluxe and also the Hansat.
Nice. And that's the bass that you have next to you, right, Mark?
That's the bass there, and in the back of me is the Padula bass.
There we go.
Here we go. And that is the bass that's the green bass. The Padula bass is on electric blue. That bass is.
And in normal times, as we're chatting during the pandemic, kind of the most common pattern upon releasing an album is kind of starting a tour circuit. But we're in such uncertain times. I'm sure everything is kind of on hold for you guys. But what plans, kind of tentatively, and I know that those are not etched in stone in any way, shape, or form.
Yes, well, Raul, this was mixed in January, I think January, and we started to get going January, February, and I was going to release this in May.
Wow.
But the COVID, the virus hit, and we had intentions of doing a duo tour, which obviously we have to put off now, but we want to do it, and we're going to do it. Mm-hmm. It's safe to go out, basically, but I don't want to travel now at all. I want to stay away from it. I don't, not to get political about the vaccine, but to me, at this point, it doesn't seem like it's a polio vaccine where it eradicates it. You're going to have to live with it, and we're going to have to social distance and wear masks and all that. So anyway, we will tour eventually with it, but we had to put that on hold, as well as every other touring. I had to cancel all my work for this year for touring in Europe and in the fall. But we decided to release the record in September because we just wanted people to hear it. And it was relevant, and that's what we decided to postpone it. So it's coming out September 2020. Interesting, it's also released on vinyl as an LP. It's my first foray into vinyl. We used to do records, obviously, in the old days.
Sure.
Many. And so this is on my label, which is called Wave Tone Records.
Okay.
So it's the first vinyl on my records. I have 25 releases on my label, and it's an ongoing label that I release all my music on. I've had it since 1993, and this is number 26, actually. So it was interesting for the vinyl, going back and learning about mastering. I had a great mastering engineer master it, Phil McDonough. Especially bass is problematic with records, because if it's too hot, it'll jump off the track. The needle will skip. So at a certain point, I forget what dB level, but the bass goes to mono. If it's stereo bass, it goes to mono at a certain level so that it doesn't move. It's not too wide.
Wow.
There's a lot of different considerations. So on the record, there's one less song because we couldn't fit all of the 8 songs on it. So if you get the CD, it's a bonus track.
There you go.
But we went with, I investigated a lot, and it's a really high-end pressing. It's 180 gram. Sounds like drugs, but
No.
180, 180 gram vinyl record. It sounds, the sound quality is great to me. I still have a turntable, and I got a new turntable, and I love that, just the sound of vinyl going around without any sound, just that low, you know. But this, we did it. And Raul, when I was working with the record, I was thinking like of records like the Beatles and Paul McCartney and how loud the bass was.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that's due to the fact that there were 45s on some of it, the non-LPs on the early tracks.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've talked with other bassists about Paul McCartney and everything. And, but a lot of times, Paul, as they later in the production, would record his bass after they did other tracks. That was, if you record it with the drums, it would be a scratch thing. So he could play really loud in a room with, you know, a great microphone and get the sound of the room. And so, anyway, the bass is, I'm always amazed at how loud in some of the Beatles songs the bass is. So I wanted to be able to get the bass on Electric Blue, this new record, as loud as we could, not just so the bass would be loud, but because it's just bass and drums, I wanted as much presence as possible. So I think we achieved it. You know, the listener will know, but it was a great learning experience. And CDs don't sell anymore. I really only print CDs up to send to radio stations because not all radio stations are taking digital files at the moment. They can be threes, but WAV files, you put it out there, and that a WAV file is a master, you know?
Yeah.
So I wanted to experiment, and there's more vinyl sales now than CD sales, which I don't know if that's really saying much because I don't think a lot of people buy records, but I wanted to get into that aspect of the market with the business, with records. So we'll see. It's an experiment, and approaching different audiophile magazines to see if they want to do reviews of it. And I purposely, you know, went with the heavier 180 gram pressing for audiophile people that want to get that. So let's see, but it was a great process. And, you know, we had, as I mentioned, we're going to put the record out in May, but a lot of time to really get all the promotional aspects of it together with radio, which is going to start in September. We mailed out 315 CDs to radio, to all the jazz stations, jam band, some new age maybe, alternative college radio. It's probably most of the DJs are doing it from home. So as you can see, I'm a multifaceted person with not only music, but I enjoy having a record company and working with that, and especially with having the time now, with, you know, not being on the road and being in my all the time. I have time to do a lot of things, not only aside from the business. Because if you were to tell me what are your main focal points as what your expression is or what your expertise is, it would be a bass player, a fretless bass player. It's a bass player, a composer, a producer, and then the rest of the business is a record company business and dealing with that. And it's been made much easier because of, started out with CD Baby, but now with selling digitally online and everything. But so, you know, that's sort of the way it is. But for me, it's all about creativity and being in the moment and playing music in the moment. That's what to do.
Well, and there has to be a real acute awareness on how things are being consumed, and I'm going to call it some flexibility and adaptability, because if you can just assume that you have figured out one way to do things and that's going to keep on working, that doesn't seem to be the case. I'd had a conversation with Victor Wooten. It'll come up on many of my interviews when he had pointed out that back in the day, people would get free TV and they would pay for music. We would buy records. We'd buy those 45s. We'd wait for that LP to come out and save up our money and go and pick it up. But now people will pay for TV and they want music for free. And so for you to be able to monetize, appealing to a market, which the whole vinyl movement, really, it's amazing to me because it was a big thing when we were growing up. And you always trying to get a better turntable and a better sound system, and you had brands, exotic brands. I always Onkyo and whoever doing stuff that like, oh wow, if I could just get an Onkyo preamp or something like this, it'd be so cool, and good speakers and the works. It was just kind of an ongoing thing, and especially when we wanted to. I think for listening, it was great. For those of us that were trying to lift tunes and would keep trying to move the needle back and forth, it was a pain. And so when things like cassettes and CDs came out, you're like, oh, I can replay this, or I can go back a few bars and listen to that lick again instead of letting it play through and move the needle and all that stuff. But for people to have the hearing experience, I think it's prudent, and it sounds like a very wise direction to go to have that vinyl option as well. Now, if people want to know more about what's going on with this, where they can get it, markegan.com is the best place to look?
Yes, markegan.com, and it says the store, I think.
Okay.
Store is one of the buttons, and in there, but basically the record will be available on Amazon and Apple Music and iTunes, all the streaming, every possible digital outlet. But you can see all of the Wavetone releases at my website, markegan.com.
Nice. And
I'm in the process of setting up a Bandcamp site to put my label at, Wavetone Records. So it'll be just a separate outlet for Wavetone Records there.
Very cool. Well, Mark, we appreciate you taking time out of a little of your quiet pandemic time, as we all are experiencing, to chat with it. Folks, you've seen him here. Mark Egan coming to you live on Bass Musician Magazine. Make sure you check out Electric Blue.
Thank you, Raul. Thank you.